Hey guys, tonight we're stepping through the heavy wooden doors of a medieval castle, where the air tastes of smoke and stone, and your breath forms little clouds even in summer. You're about to discover what it was really like to call a fortress home, where every sunrise brings the clatter of armor, the shuffle of servants, and the constant reminder that comfort was a luxury few could afford. You probably won't survive this without developing a profound appreciation for modern plumbing, central heating, and the simple joy of privacy. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing how this community spans the globe, from midnight in Manchester to dawn in Denver. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first pale light of dawn creeps through the narrow arrow slits that serve as your windows, casting thin silver lines across the rough stone floor of your chamber. You're not exactly waking up in luxury here. Your bed is a simple straw mattress covered with whatever wool blankets you've managed to acquire, and the stone walls around you hold the night's chill like a jealous lover. The air smells of wood smoke from dying embers in the hearth, mixed with the mustiness that seems to live permanently in castle walls, along with something vaguely livestockish that you've learned not to think about too hard. Your day begins not with an alarm clock, but with the deep, resonant toll of the chapel bell echoing through the corridors. This isn't a gentle suggestion to wake up. This is a command that reaches into every corner of the castle, from the lowest dungeon to the highest tower. The bell ringer, probably a monk or dedicated servant, has been up since well before dawn, and frankly, you're starting to suspect he enjoys his job a little too much. But this is how time works in your world. Not by digital displays or smartphone notifications, but by the rhythm of bells that divide your day into segments of prayer, work, meals, and more work. As you swing your legs over the side of your bed, your feet hit the cold stone floor with a shock that travels up your spine. Historians tell us that rushes and straw were often scattered across castle floors to provide some insulation and absorb moisture. But let's be honest, it was basically medieval carpeting made of whatever vegetation you could find, and it needed changing about as often as you'd expect when hundreds of people are tracking mud, spilled ale, and worse across it daily. Some castles had the luxury of imported rugs or tapestries, but those were reserved for the most important chambers, and unless you're the lord or lady of this particular fortress, you're getting the full stone floor experience. You reach for the clay pitcher beside your bed and pour water into a matching basin, assuming the water hasn't frozen overnight, which happens more often than you'd like. Medieval castles were not built for comfort. They were built to keep enemies out and to project power, which means thick walls that stay cold and windows that prioritize defense over natural light. The water is shockingly cold against your face, but it serves its purpose of jolting you fully awake and reminding you that today, like every day, will require a certain amount of endurance. The sounds of the castle waking up filter through your chamber walls. The scrape of heavy doors opening, the shuffle of feet on stone stairs, muffled conversations in the corridors, and the distant clatter from the kitchens where servants are already stoking fires and beginning the monumental task of feeding everyone in the castle. There's also the sound that becomes as familiar as your own heartbeat. The jingle and clank of chainmail and weapons as guards change shifts and knights prepare for their daily routines. One fascinating detail that often surprises people is that castle chambers often had what were called garderobes, essentially medieval bathrooms built into the wall thickness, with a shaft that dropped waste directly outside the castle walls. Now, before you get too excited about medieval plumbing, remember that this was basically a hole in the wall with a wooden seat, and the plumbing consisted of gravity and the hope that the wind was blowing in the right direction. Historians still argue whether the ammonia smell from these garderobes actually helped repel moth from stored clothing, or whether that's just a convenient story we tell ourselves to make medieval life seem slightly more hygienic than it actually was. You dress in layers because that's how you survive castle life. A linen undertunic that you probably haven't washed in longer than you'd admit, followed by a wool tunic or dress, and if you're lucky enough to own one, an outer garment for warmth. The clothing is practical rather than fashionable, designed to be sturdy and reparable because replacement isn't exactly an option. Your shoes, if you have good ones, are leather boots that you've carefully maintained because walking on castle stones in poor footwear is a recipe for disaster. As you finish dressing, you can hear the castle truly coming to life around you. Servants are moving through the corridors with purpose, their arms full of rushes, firewood, or linens. Somewhere, a blacksmith's hammer has begun its rhythmic pounding, and you can smell the first hints of breakfast preparation wafting up from the kitchens. Bread baking, porridge cooking, and if you're very lucky, the rich aroma of meat being prepared for the Lord's table. The reality of castle life is hitting you already. Everything takes longer than it should, everything is harder than it needs to be, and privacy is essentially a myth. But there's also something oddly comforting about the routine, the sense that you're part of something larger and more permanent than yourself. These stones have sheltered people for generations before you, and they'll continue long after you're gone. Your day in the castle has officially begun, and trust me, you're going to need every ounce of that medieval resilience to get through what's coming next. The Great Hall stretches before you like a medieval theater where everyone knows their role, their lines, and most importantly, their place. This isn't just a dining room. It's the beating heart of castle social life, where politics, gossip, and survival intersect over bowls of porridge and whatever meat managed to make it to the table. You're about to navigate a social minefield that makes modern office politics look like a friendly game of checkers. The hall itself is genuinely impressive, even by today's standards. We're talking about a space that could easily fit a couple of modern houses inside it, with soaring ceilings supported by massive wooden beams that were probably trees older than anyone currently alive. Tapestries hang from the walls, not just for decoration, but because they actually help insulate these massive stone chambers and reduce the echo that would otherwise make conversation impossible. The floor is covered with rushes that crunch pleasantly underfoot, though you're learning not to look too closely at what might be mixed in with the straw. At the far end of the hall, elevated on a platform called the dais, sits the high table where the Lord, his family, and his most important guests take their meals. This isn't just about getting the best food, though they definitely do. It's about sight lines and psychology. Everyone in the hall can see the Lord, and more importantly, the Lord can see everyone else. It's like having a throne room disguised as a dining room. And the message is clear. Even when we're all eating together, we're not all equal. The seating arrangement below the high table is a complex social map that you've learned to read like your life depends on it, because frankly, it might. Knights and their families sit closer to the high table, followed by castle officials like the steward, the marshal, and the chaplain. Skilled craftsmen and their apprentices get their own section, while servants eat quickly and quietly at tables near the kitchen entrance. There's even a specific protocol for where visiting merchants, traveling knights, or pilgrims might be seated based on their perceived importance and the Lord's current political needs. Here's something that might surprise you. Medieval people actually had quite sophisticated table manners, at least among the upper classes. There were detailed rules about how to share dishes, how to use your knife properly, forks weren't really a thing yet, and how to behave when sharing a drinking cup with someone. You're expected to wipe your mouth before drinking from shared cup, not to blow your nose at the table, and definitely not to scratch yourself or spit while others are eating. The irony is that while the food might be fairly crude by modern standards, the social expectations around eating it were remarkably refined. The morning meal itself is a study in medieval nutrition and economics. For most people, breakfast consists of bread, always bread, accompanied by weak ale or watered wine because the water isn't reliably safe to drink. The bread ranges from coarse, dark loaves made from whatever grain was available to finer white bread that's reserved for the high table. There might be cheese if the castle has productive dairy animals, porridge made from oats or barley, and if you're very fortunate, some preserved meat or fish. But here's where castle life gets interesting. You're not just eating, you're participating in a daily performance of loyalty and hierarchy. When the Lord enters the hall, everyone stands. When he sits, you sit. When he raises his cup for a toast, you raise yours. These aren't empty gestures. They're public demonstrations of the social contract that keeps this entire system functioning. The Lord provides protection and sustenance. You provide service and loyalty. Break that contract, and you might find yourself eating outside the castle walls permanently. One particularly fascinating aspect of Great Hall dining is the role of entertainment. This isn't silent eating while staring at your medieval smartphone. There are often musicians, storytellers, or traveling performers providing background entertainment. Sometimes it's a harpist playing gentle melodies. Other times it might be a storyteller recounting epic tales of distant battles or romantic adventures. Historians still argue whether these performances were primarily for entertainment or whether they served as a form of news distribution, spreading information about events in distant lands through songs and stories. The conversation around you is a masterclass in medieval diplomacy. People are discussing everything from crop yields and livestock breeding to news from other castles and rumors about political alliances. But you quickly learn that there are topics you simply don't bring up in mixed company. Criticism of the Lord, questioning of church doctrine, or anything that might be construed as seditious. The walls may be stone, but they definitely have ears, and information has a way of traveling quickly through castle corridors. There's also the fascinating dynamics of the servants who move through the hall during meals. They're not invisible. Medieval people weren't that oblivious to the humans serving them, but they occupy a strange social space where they're simultaneously essential and nearly powerless. They know everyone's business, hear every conversation, and yet are expected to maintain complete discretion. Some of the most politically savvy people in the castle are the servants who've learned to navigate these treacherous waters while keeping their ears open and their mouths shut. As the meal progresses, you notice the subtle ways that information flows through the hall. A quiet word in someone's ear, a meaningful glance across the room, a particular way someone responds to a toast. The Great Hall is functioning as the castle's primary communication network, where news, gossip, alliances, and warnings are exchanged along with food and drink. Miss too many meals, and you might find yourself dangerously out of touch with the political currents that could affect your future. The morning meal typically lasts longer than you might expect. Not because the food is particularly elaborate, but because it serves so many social functions beyond nutrition. By the time people begin to disperse to their daily duties, relationships have been reinforced, information has been exchanged, and the social hierarchy has been publicly acknowledged and reinforced for another day. You finish your bread and ale, wipe your hands on the communal towel, and prepare to leave the Great Hall for the day's work. But you're already thinking about the evening meal because in castle life, these communal gatherings aren't just about food. They're about survival, and surviving medieval castle life requires mastering the intricate social dance that plays out 3 times a day in this magnificent, drafty, politically charged space. The castle kitchen is where medieval ambition meets prehistoric technology, and the results are exactly as chaotic as you'd expect. You're descending into a world that operates somewhere between a restaurant kitchen and a small industrial operation. Except instead of modern appliances, you've got open flames, questionable food safety practices, and a staff that's managing to feed anywhere from 50 to several hundred people daily using techniques that would give modern health inspectors nightmares. The kitchen itself is typically located in a separate building or at least a separate section of the castle, and there's a very good reason for this: fire safety. Medieval cooking involves a lot of open flames, and castle builders weren't stupid. They knew that putting the most fire-prone operation right next to their wooden buildings and stored grain was asking for trouble. So the kitchen often sits in its own stone building, connected to the main castle by covered walkways or courtyards, which means that getting hot food from kitchen to Great Hall requires a level of coordination that would challenge modern catering companies. The moment you step into the kitchen, you're hit by a wall of sensory overload. The air is thick with smoke from multiple fires burning simultaneously. The great hearth where large roasts turn on spits, smaller cooking fires for pots and pans, and the bread ovens that radiate heat like medieval furnaces. The smell is a complex mixture of wood smoke, cooking meat, baking bread, herbs, and something vaguely unidentifiable that you're learning not to investigate too closely. The noise level is incredible. Pots clanging, knives chopping on wooden blocks, servants shouting instructions to each other, animals squealing in adjacent areas, and a constant crackle and pop of fires. The kitchen staff operates with a hierarchy almost as complex as the Great Hall's social structure. At the top is the head cook or kitchen master, who's responsible for planning meals, managing supplies, and ensuring that the Lord's table gets properly impressive food. Below him are various specialized roles: the spit boys who turn the roasting meat, the bread bakers who manage the ovens, the brewers who keep the ale flowing, and general kitchen servants who do everything from hauling water to cleaning pots. It's like a medieval culinary brigade system, except with more shouting and significantly more risk of serious burns. Here's something that might surprise you about medieval cooking: the sheer variety of techniques and ingredients that skilled castle cooks could employ. Yes, there were no tomatoes, potatoes, or chocolate. Those came from the Americas much later. But medieval cooks had access to an impressive array of spices, herbs, and preservation techniques. A well-stocked castle kitchen might have pepper, cinnamon, ginger, cloves, and other expensive spices that were literally worth their weight in gold. The catch is that most of these ingredients were reserved for the Lord's table, while the common folk may do with whatever herbs grew locally and whatever seasoning they could forage or grow themselves. The daily routine in the castle kitchen begins well before dawn, and frankly, it doesn't really end until well after everyone else has gone to bed. The bakers start first because bread takes time and everyone in the castle expects fresh bread daily. The ovens need to be heated, dough that's been rising overnight needs to be shaped and baked, and there's always yesterday's leftover bread to be repurposed into breadcrumbs, trenchers, or ingredients for other dishes. Medieval people wasted nothing, and bread that was too stale for eating became the foundation for soups, stuffings, and even a kind of medieval bread pudding. The meat preparation is where things get really medieval. Animals are often slaughtered on site, which means the kitchen staff needs to know how to break down entire carcasses efficiently. There's no refrigeration, obviously, so meat needs to be cooked quickly, preserved through salting or smoking, or kept alive until it's needed. The castle might have fish ponds, chicken coops, and livestock pens right on the grounds, which means your breakfast eggs were probably collected that morning, and your dinner chicken was probably walking around making chicken noises just a few hours ago. One absolutely fascinating aspect of medieval castle cooking is the concept of trenchers, thick slices of stale bread that's served as edible plates. Instead of washing dishes after every meal, diners would eat their food off these bread plates, and then either eat the trencher itself or give it to servants or the poor. It was an elegant solution to the dishwashing problem, and it meant that even the plates were contributing to nutrition rather than creating waste. Historians still argue whether this practice developed primarily for practical reasons or whether it had religious significance related to medieval concepts of charity and avoiding waste. The preservation techniques used in castle kitchens were incredibly sophisticated for their time. Meats were salted, smoked, or preserved in fat. Fruits were dried, turned into preserves with honey, or fermented into various alcoholic beverages. Vegetables were pickled, dried, or stored in root cellars that maintained surprisingly consistent temperatures. The castle kitchen wasn't just preparing daily meals. It was managing a complex food storage and preservation operation that needed to keep everyone fed through winter months when fresh food was scarce or non-existent. But here's the thing about medieval kitchen work. It was genuinely dangerous. You're working with open flames, boiling liquids, sharp knives, and heavy iron cookware, all while wearing long sleeves and dealing with floors that might be slippery with spilled liquids or animal fat. Kitchen servants regularly suffered burns, cuts, and other injuries that could become infected easily in an era before antibiotics. Plus, there's the constant risk of food poisoning from ingredients that might not be as fresh as they appear, or from contamination during the cooking process. The timing of castle meal preparation required military-level precision. The evening meal, in particular, was a major production that needed to serve potentially hundreds of people simultaneously, with different courses appearing in proper sequence, and with the most important dishes arriving at the high table perfectly prepared and properly hot. This meant that kitchen staff needed to coordinate the cooking of multiple dishes with different preparation times, all while managing fires that couldn't be easily adjusted like modern burners. As you watch the controlled chaos of castle kitchen operations, you're witnessing one of the most essential and underappreciated aspects of medieval life. These kitchens were the engines that powered castle society, turning raw ingredients into the fuel that kept everyone from lords to servants functioning. It was hot, dangerous, exhausting work, but it was also skilled work that required genuine expertise and coordination. The kitchen never really stops. Even when the main meals are finished, there's cleaning, preparation for the next day, bread dough to be mixed and set to rise, and the endless cycle of maintaining fires, managing supplies, and keeping the whole operation running smoothly. Welcome to medieval personal care, where the phrase cleanliness is next to godliness takes on a whole new meaning, and that meaning is mostly good luck with that. You're about to discover that staying clean in a castle environment requires creativity, determination, and a significantly different relationship with your own body odors than you're probably used to. The good news is that medieval people weren't actually as dirty as popular culture suggests. The challenging news is that their standards of cleanliness were necessarily quite different from ours. Let's start with the basics. Bathing. Contrary to popular belief, medieval people did bathe, but the logistics of castle bathing were complicated enough that it couldn't be a daily routine. First, you need to heat water, which means building fires and hauling heavy containers of water from wells or streams. Then you need a vessel large enough to bathe in. Wooden tubs were common, but they needed to be maintained and stored somewhere, and they weren't exactly lightweight when filled with water. The whole process required significant advance planning, multiple people to help with preparation, and a substantial investment of time and fuel. The typical castle bathing routine involved heating water in large cauldrons over the kitchen fires, then transporting it to wooden tubs that were often lined with cloth to make them more comfortable and to prevent splinters in unfortunate places. Soap existed, but it was typically made from animal fat and ash, which produced a harsh cleanser that was effective but not exactly luxurious. Wealthier castle residents might have access to imported soaps made with olive oil, or they might add herbs and flowers to their bathwater for fragrance and supposed medicinal benefits. Here's something fascinating. Medieval people understood the connection between cleanliness and health, even if they didn't understand the scientific reasons behind it. Medical texts from the period recommend regular bathing for health, and there are numerous references to the importance of clean clothing and personal hygiene. The challenge wasn't ignorance, it was logistics. Imagine trying to maintain modern hygiene standards when every drop of hot water has to be heated over with fire, and every piece of soap has to be made by hand from scratch. The garderobe system deserves special attention because it represents medieval engineering applied to a very basic human need. These weren't just holes in the wall. They were carefully designed waste disposal systems that took advantage of castle architecture. The garderobe was typically built into the thickness of the outer wall, with a shaft that carried waste directly outside the castle walls, often into a moat or river. Some castles had remarkably sophisticated garderobe systems with multiple levels, proper ventilation, and even primitive sewage management. But using a garderobe in winter was an experience that built character. Imagine sitting on a wooden seat over a hole that opens directly to the outside air, while cold wind blows up through the shaft, and you're wearing multiple layers of medieval clothing that need to be carefully managed to avoid unfortunate accidents. Plus, there's the constant awareness that you're essentially hanging your most vulnerable parts out over a several-story drop. Medieval people were tougher than us, and garderobe usage is solid evidence of this fact. Personal hygiene also involved a lot of creative solutions that might seem strange to us, but made perfect sense in their context. People used rough linen cloths for cleaning themselves, and these cloths were washed and reused, though probably not as frequently as we'd prefer. Teeth were cleaned with cloths, salt, or primitive toothbrushes made from twigs. Hair was washed occasionally with various concoctions involving herbs, eggs, or other natural ingredients. But daily hair washing was neither expected nor practical. One particularly interesting aspect of medieval hygiene was the use of perfumes and scented oils, not just for luxury, but for practical odor management. When bathing is a weekly or monthly event rather than a daily routine, you need other strategies for maintaining social acceptability. Wealthy castle residents might use imported perfumes, while others relied on locally available herbs like lavender, rosemary, or mint. Some people wore sachets of herbs in their clothing or used scented oils on their skin. The laundry situation in castles was a major operation that happened periodically rather than continuously. Clothing was expensive and time-consuming to make, so people owned fewer items but wore them longer between washings. When laundry day arrived, it was an all-hands event involving hauling water, heating it in large cauldrons, scrubbing clothes with harsh soap, and then finding places to dry everything. The process could take days, especially in winter when indoor drying was the only option. Historians still argue about how frequently medieval people changed their underclothes, but the evidence suggests that people who could afford it did change their linen undergarments regularly, even if their outer clothes were worn repeatedly. Linen was actually preferred for undergarments because it could be washed more easily than wool, and clean linen against the skin was considered essential for health and comfort. The realities of menstruation in castle life required practical solutions that most history books skip over entirely. Women used strips of linen cloth that were washed and reused, and they had to manage this aspect of their lives with limited privacy and resources. The medieval understanding of women's health was limited, but there were traditional remedies and practices that helped women manage their monthly cycles as comfortably as possible given the circumstances. Hair care was another area where medieval people showed remarkable ingenuity. Long hair was fashionable and practical. It provided warmth and could be styled to indicate social status, but maintaining it without modern shampoos and conditioners required creativity. People used various rinses made from herbs, vinegar, or other natural ingredients to keep their hair clean and manageable. Combs were carved from bone or wood and were treasured possessions that were often passed down through families. The psychological aspects of medieval hygiene are fascinating to consider. These people lived with their bodies and their smells in a way that's almost impossible for us to imagine. They had different expectations about personal odors, and their social norms around bodily functions were necessarily more accepting than ours. But they also understood the social importance of cleanliness and made genuine efforts to maintain hygiene standards within the constraints of their technology and resources. As you navigate your daily hygiene routine in the castle, you're constantly balancing practical limitations with social expectations, personal comfort with available resources, and individual preferences with communal living realities. It's a reminder that human dignity and self-care persist even under challenging circumstances, and that people throughout history have found ways to maintain personal standards and social acceptability regardless of the obstacles they faced. The training yard is where medieval reality meets medieval fantasy. And spoiler alert, reality wins, usually by leaving you bruised, exhausted, and questioning your life choices. You're entering a space that's part gymnasium, part classroom, and part controlled violence laboratory, where the curriculum consists of learning to hurt people efficiently while avoiding being hurt yourself. The stakes are higher than any modern sport because the skills you're developing here aren't for competition. They're for survival. The training yard itself is typically a large, open area within the castle walls, with packed earth or sand underfoot to provide some cushioning when, not if, you hit the ground. The space is surrounded by practice equipment that looks like it was designed by someone with a very practical understanding of violence. Wooden posts wrapped in straw for sword practice, archery targets that have seen better days, and various contraptions designed to simulate combat situations. There are also racks of practice weapons that are designed to hurt you just enough to teach proper respect for real combat, without actually killing you in the learning process. If you're training to be a knight, your day in the practice yard begins early and ends late, because becoming competent with medieval weapons requires the kind of repetitive practice that builds muscle memory and reflexes. You're not just learning to swing a sword. You're developing the physical conditioning, hand-eye coordination, and tactical thinking that might keep you alive when someone is actively trying to end your existence. The training is methodical, progressive, and absolutely relentless. Sword training starts with basic movements that feel deceptively simple until you realize you'll be repeating them hundreds of times. You're learning proper stance, footwork, and how to hold your weapon without telegraphing your intentions to an opponent. The practice swords are wooden, but they're weighted to approximate real weapons, and they're perfectly capable of delivering bruises that will remind you of your mistakes for days. Your instructor, probably a grizzled knight or man-at-arms who survived actual combat, has little patience for complaints about sore muscles or minor injuries. Here's something that might surprise you. Medieval combat training was incredibly sophisticated, with detailed techniques for different weapons, armor configurations, and tactical situations. There were actual fighting manuals, some of which survive today, that documented specific techniques, combinations, and strategies. These weren't just collections of basic moves. They were comprehensive systems that covered everything from single combat to battlefield tactics. The training you're receiving has been refined through generations of actual combat experience. Archery training is its own special form of medieval torture, disguised as a necessary skill. Drawing a medieval war bow requires significantly more strength than modern recreational archery, and doing it repeatedly while maintaining accuracy is genuinely exhausting. Your fingers develop calluses, your shoulder and back muscles adapt to the repetitive stress, and you learn to judge distance, wind, and target movement in ways that become almost intuitive. The targets start close and gradually move farther away as your skills develop. But even experienced archers miss regularly because medieval archery is genuinely difficult. The mounted combat training is where things get really interesting, assuming you survive the basic challenge of staying on a horse while holding weapons and trying to hit targets. Medieval warfare cavalry wasn't just about riding fast. It required precise coordination between rider and horse, the ability to use weapons effectively while mounted, and the balance and strength to remain effective in combat, even when your horse is moving unpredictably. Plus, horses have their own opinions about combat, and those opinions don't always align with your tactical objectives. One fascinating aspect of medieval combat training is the emphasis on fighting in armor, which changes everything about how you move and fight. Armor provides protection, but it also limits mobility, affects your balance, and requires specific techniques to be effective. You're learning to fight while wearing what amounts to a wearable iron box, which means every movement requires more energy. Every technique needs to be modified for your limited range of motion, and falling down becomes a serious tactical problem because getting back up quickly in full armor is genuinely challenging. The psychological aspects of combat training are as important as the physical skills. You're learning to function effectively while experiencing genuine fear, pain, and exhaustion. Medieval combat training included exercises designed to simulate the stress and chaos of real battle. Because knowing techniques isn't enough. You need to be able to execute them when you're terrified, tired, and possibly injured. This psychological conditioning was considered as essential as weapon skills. Group combat training introduces you to the complexities of medieval battlefield tactics. You're learning to fight as part of a unit, to coordinate with other fighters, and to maintain formation even when everything around you is chaos. This isn't individual heroics, it's team violence, where your survival depends as much on the people around you as on your own skills. The training scenarios become increasingly complex, simulating various battlefield conditions and tactical challenges. Historians still argue about how much actual combat training was available to different social classes within castle communities. Knights obviously received extensive training, but men-at-arms, castle guards, and even some servants would have received at least basic instruction in weapons use. The level of training varied considerably based on your role and social status. But most adult males in a castle environment would have had some familiarity with weapons and basic combat techniques. The injury rate in medieval combat training was significant, despite efforts to make practice safer than actual combat. Broken bones, cuts, bruises, and more serious injuries were common enough that castle communities needed to maintain supplies of medical treatment materials and have people skilled in treating combat-related injuries. The training was dangerous because the skills being taught were inherently dangerous. and there was no way to completely eliminate risk while still providing realistic preparation for combat. The training schedule was relentless, typically beginning at dawn and continuing for several hours, with additional practice sessions throughout the day as duties allowed. This wasn't a hobby or recreational activity. It was professional development for people whose jobs might literally depend on their combat skills. The physical demands were enormous, requiring strength, endurance, flexibility, and coordination that needed to be maintained constantly because skills degraded quickly without regular practice. Recovery and conditioning were important aspects of training that often get overlooked in modern discussions of medieval combat. Fighters needed to manage their bodies carefully, balancing intensive training with adequate rest, nutrition, and injury prevention. Medieval people understood the importance of physical conditioning, and they developed various techniques for maintaining strength, flexibility, and endurance using the resources available to them. As you finish another day in the training yard, covered in sweat, dirt, and probably some blood, you're beginning to understand that medieval combat skills weren't just about violence. They were about discipline, dedication, and the kind of systematic preparation that separates professionals from amateurs. The training is brutal, but it's brutal with purpose, and that purpose might someday keep you alive when the stakes are real and the consequences are permanent. The chapel bell's bronze voice cuts through the castle air with the kind of authority that brooks no argument, and you're learning that in medieval life, God's schedule takes precedence over pretty much everything else. You're about to enter a space where spiritual devotion meets political maneuvering, where prayers are offered alongside careful observations of who's present, who's absent, and who's positioning themselves strategically for maximum visibility during the most sacred moments of the day. The castle chapel itself is usually one of the most beautifully decorated spaces in the entire fortress, which tells you something important about medieval priorities. While most castle rooms are functional and spare, the chapel features carved stonework, colorful painted walls, stained glass windows if the castle can afford them, and religious artifacts that represent significant financial investments. This isn't just about spiritual devotion. It's about displaying piety publicly, demonstrating the Lord's connection to divine authority, and creating a space impressive enough to reinforce the social and religious hierarchy that keeps medieval society functioning. You file into the chapel with everyone else in the castle community, from the Lord and his family down to the humblest servants. But even here, hierarchy reasserts itself with mathematical precision. The Lord and Lady occupy ornate chairs or pews near the altar, followed by knights and their families, then castle officials, skilled craftsmen, and finally servants standing in the back. It's like a three-dimensional organizational chart rendered in human bodies, and everyone knows exactly where they belong without needing to be told. The chapel services themselves are conducted in Latin, which creates an interesting dynamic because most of the people present don't actually understand what's being said. You're participating in a ritual that's simultaneously deeply meaningful and largely incomprehensible, following along with responses you've memorized phonetically while the actual meaning remains mysterious. The priest or chaplain conducts the service with practiced efficiency, moving through prayers, readings, and ceremonies that connect your small castle community to the broader Christian world that extends across medieval Europe. But here's where chapel life gets politically interesting. Attendance isn't optional, and your level of visible devotion is being noted by people who matter. Medieval Christianity wasn't just a private spiritual matter. It was a public demonstration of social conformity and political loyalty. The way you kneel, how attentively you appear to listen, whether you cross yourself at the appropriate moments, and how generously you contribute to church collections are all being observed and mentally cataloged by your neighbors, superiors, and subordinates. One fascinating aspect of medieval chapel life is the role of religious festivals and special observances that punctuate the calendar year. These aren't just spiritual events. They're social celebrations that provide rare opportunities for relaxation, special foods, and community bonding. The chapel becomes the focal point for Christmas celebrations, Easter observances, saints' feast days, and other religious holidays that break up the routine of daily castle life. During these special occasions, The normal social restrictions are sometimes relaxed, and even servants might find themselves participating in celebrations that would be unthinkable during ordinary times. The castle chaplain occupies a unique position in the social hierarchy because he serves multiple masters: God, the church hierarchy, and the castle lord who provides his living arrangements. This creates interesting tensions because the chaplain is expected to provide spiritual guidance that sometimes conflicts with political expediency. He might need to counsel the Lord about moral issues while remaining diplomatically silent about practices that keep the castle functioning but might not align perfectly with Christian teachings. Historians still argue whether medieval chaplains were primarily spiritual advisors or political functionaries, and the truth probably varied considerably depending on the individual and circumstances. Private confession adds another layer of complexity to chapel life because it creates a space where social hierarchies are temporarily suspended and people can speak freely about their sins, fears, and moral struggles. The chaplain hears confessions from everyone in the castle community, from the lord to the stable boys, which gives him an incredibly detailed understanding of the personal dynamics, guilty secrets, and interpersonal conflicts that shape castle life. This knowledge makes him potentially very powerful, but it also makes his position potentially dangerous if he handles sensitive information inappropriately. The chapel also serves important administrative functions that go well beyond spiritual services. Marriages are performed here, children are baptized, and funeral services are conducted for community members who die. These ceremonies mark the major life transitions that bind the castle community together across generations. The chapel records, births, deaths, marriages, become the official documentation of family relationships and inheritance rights that might be crucial for legal disputes or property transfers. Religious education happens informally during chapel services and more formally through the chaplain's interactions with castle children and young adults. Medieval people were expected to know basic prayers, understand fundamental Christian teachings, and be able to participate appropriately in religious observances. For most people, this religious education was entirely oral since literacy was limited, but it was still comprehensive enough to provide a shared framework of beliefs and values that helped maintain social cohesion. The chapel's role during times of crisis becomes particularly important when the castle faces external threats or internal conflicts. During sieges, the chapel provides psychological comfort and spiritual support for people facing genuine danger and uncertainty. During political disputes, it becomes a space where oaths are sworn, alliances are blessed, and divine sanction is sought for various courses of action. The chapel isn't separate from castle politics. It's deeply integrated into the decision-making processes that determine the community's survival and prosperity. One particularly interesting aspect of medieval chapel life is the tradition of sanctuary, where the chapel could provide temporary protection for people fleeing justice or persecution. This wasn't just symbolic. There were actual legal protections associated with seeking sanctuary in consecrated spaces, though these protections were limited and didn't apply to all types of crimes. The chapel could become a place where normal castle authority was temporarily suspended in favor of church law. The daily rhythm of chapel services, morning prayers, midday devotions, evening services provide structure to castle life that goes beyond mere spiritual observance. These regular gatherings serve as information distribution points where announcements are made, community news is shared, and social coordination happens. Missing chapel services means missing important information about castle operations, political developments, and social events. The acoustic properties of stone chapel architecture create a unique auditory environment where sounds are amplified and enhanced in ways that can be genuinely moving. The combination of human voices, musical instruments, and stone architecture produces an audio experience that's both spiritually uplifting and emotionally powerful. Medieval people understood the psychological impact of this acoustic environment and used it deliberately to create worship experiences that engage the senses as well as the intellect. As you leave the chapel after another service, you're carrying with you not just spiritual sustenance, but also social information, political observations, and a renewed understanding of your place in the complex hierarchy that structures medieval castle life. The chapel bell will call you back tomorrow, and the day after that, because in medieval life, spiritual devotion isn't a weekend activity. It's a daily rhythm that provides both comfort and social cohesion in a world where both are genuinely necessary for survival. The workshops scattered throughout the castle complex hum with productive energy that's part industrial operation, part artist studio, and part vocational school, where medieval craftsmanship passes from one generation to the next. You're entering spaces where raw materials are transformed into the countless items that keep castle life functioning, where skilled artisans apply techniques refined over centuries, and where the boundary between practical necessity and genuine artistry blurs in ways that would make modern makers envious. The blacksmith's workshop is probably the most dramatically impressive of all the castle workshops, and it definitely wins the prize for most likely to result in serious injury if you're not paying attention. The forge burns constantly at temperatures that would make modern furnaces jealous, fed by bellows that require either constant human labor or ingenious mechanical systems powered by water wheels or windmills. The air shimmers with heat, thick with the smell of burning coal and hot metal, punctuated by the rhythmic hammering that becomes the soundtrack of medieval industry. The blacksmith himself occupies a unique position in castle society because literally everyone depends on his skills. Knights need weapons and armor maintained. Farmers need agricultural tools repaired. The kitchen needs cookware, and the castle infrastructure requires countless iron fittings, hinges, nails, and hardware. A skilled blacksmith can work with different types of metal, understand the properties of various alloys, and produce items ranging from delicate decorative work to massive structural components. The apprenticeship system means that young people spend years learning not just the physical techniques, but also the material science that makes the difference between functional metalwork and expensive failures. One fascinating aspect of medieval blacksmithing is the level of specialization that developed in larger castles or nearby towns. You might have different smiths specializing in weapons, agricultural tools, decorative work, or armor production. Each specialization required specific knowledge about materials, techniques, and finishing methods. Historians still argue about how much technical knowledge was shared between different smithing traditions. But it's clear that medieval metalworkers developed sophisticated understanding of metallurgy that wouldn't be out of place in modern manufacturing. The carpenter's workshop buzzes with different energy, less dramatic than the forge, but equally essential in requiring skills that combine engineering, artistry, and practical problem solving. Medieval carpenters worked with hand tools that required genuine expertise to use effectively, and they understood wood properties in ways that modern power tool users often miss. They could look at a tree and visualize the furniture, structural beams, or decorative elements that could be produced from different parts of the trunk, and they knew how to work with the natural characteristics of wood rather than fighting against them. The carpentry workshop produces everything from massive structural timbers that support castle buildings to delicate furniture pieces that demonstrate the craftsman's artistic capabilities. Castle carpenters built staircases, doors, window frames, furniture, and countless other wooden items using techniques that relied on precise joinery rather than modern fasteners. Watching a skilled medieval carpenter work is like observing a combination of engineer, artist, and problem solver applying generations of accumulated knowledge to transform raw timber into functional beauty. Textile production in castle workshops represents one of the most complex and time-consuming aspects of medieval manufacturing, involving multiple specialized skills and enormous investments of labor. The process begins with raw materials, wool from sheep, flax for linen, or imported silk for luxury items, and progresses through cleaning, preparation, spinning, weaving, dyeing, and finishing. Each step requires specific knowledge and skills, and the entire process from raw material to finished fabric can take months or even years for complex pieces. The castle's textile workshops might include areas for different aspects of production. Spinning wheels where thread is created from raw fibers, looms where fabric is woven, and dyeing vats where colors are applied using complex recipes involving plants, minerals, and sometimes imported materials. The women who work in these areas, and textile production was primarily women's work, possessed technical knowledge that combines chemistry, engineering, and artistry in ways that produce results ranging from utilitarian cloth for servants' clothing to elaborate tapestries that serve as both insulation and artistic display. One particularly interesting aspect of medieval textile production is the economic complexity involved in producing high-quality fabrics. The materials might come from multiple sources. The processing required specialized knowledge and equipment, and the finished products could be incredibly valuable. A single elaborate tapestry might represent months of skilled labor and expensive materials, making it a significant economic asset, as well as a functional and decorative item. The leather workshop produces items that are essential for nearly every aspect of castle life, from practical work gear to luxury accessories that display social status. Medieval leatherworkers, cordwainers, as they were often called, transformed animal hides into everything from shoes and belts to armor components and book bindings. The tanning process itself was lengthy, smelly, and required careful attention to produce leather with the right characteristics for different applications. Leatherworking involved understanding different animal hides, various tanning methods, and finishing techniques that could produce leather ranging from soft, flexible materials suitable for clothing to thick, rigid leather appropriate for armor or heavy-duty equipment. The workshop tools were specialized and expensive, and the skills required genuine expertise that took years to develop. A master leatherworker could examine a piece of raw hide and predict exactly what it would be suitable for after proper processing. The pottery workshop addresses the constant need for storage containers, cooking vessels, and tableware that keeps castle kitchens and storerooms functioning. Medieval potters worked with local clay when possible, but they also understood how to modify clay bodies with additives to achieve specific properties. The pottery wheel required skill to operate effectively, and glazing techniques could produce both functional and decorative results. Castle pottery production had to balance artistic considerations with practical requirements because the vessels needed to be functional as well as attractive. Cooking pots needed to withstand repeated heating and cooling. Storage vessels needed to be waterproof and pest-resistant, and tableware needed to be durable enough for daily use while being attractive enough for the Lord's table. The interconnected nature of castle workshops creates a complex economy where different craftsmen depend on each other's products and expertise. The blacksmith needs wooden handles for tools. The carpenter needs metal fittings and hardware. The leatherworker needs metal tools and wooden forms, and everyone needs pottery vessels for various aspects of their work. This interdependence creates a collaborative environment where skills and knowledge are shared, and innovations in one workshop often influence techniques in others. Apprenticeship systems in castle workshops provide pathways for social mobility and skill development that were relatively rare in medieval society. A talented young person could potentially learn valuable skills that would provide economic security and social status. Though the apprenticeship period was long, demanding, and often involved years of basic labor before actual skill training began. Master craftsmen took their teaching responsibilities seriously because their reputations depended on the quality of work produced by people they had trained. The seasonal rhythm of workshop production reflects the agricultural calendar and the practical realities of medieval life. Some types of work were more suitable for winter months when agricultural demands were lighter, while other projects needed to be completed during specific seasons when materials were available or weather conditions were appropriate. Workshop schedules balanced immediate needs with long-term projects, emergency repairs with planned production, and individual orders with items produced for general castle use. As you move through the various workshops, you're witnessing the intersection of necessity and artistry that characterized medieval craftsmanship. These aren't just production facilities. They're centers of innovation, education, and cultural transmission where practical skills are combined with aesthetic sensibilities to create objects that serve immediate needs while demonstrating the human capacity for transforming raw materials into items of genuine beauty and lasting functionality. Standing guard on the castle walls gives you a perspective on medieval life that's simultaneously boring and terrifying. offering long stretches of routine observation punctuated by moments of genuine danger that can materialize with little warning. You're occupying one of the most strategically important positions in the entire castle defense system, responsible for early warning detection that could mean the difference between successful defense and catastrophic defeat for everyone living within these walls. The castle walls themselves are marvels of medieval engineering that represent generations of accumulated knowledge about defensive architecture. These aren't just tall stone barriers. They're complex systems designed to maximize defensive advantages while minimizing weaknesses that attackers might exploit. The height provides obvious benefits for observation and ranged weapon use. But the thickness of the walls, the placement of towers, the design of battlements, and countless other architectural details all reflect sophisticated understanding of siege warfare and defensive strategy. Your position on the wall walk, the protected pathway that runs along the top of the walls, gives you a commanding view of the surrounding countryside that extends for miles in every direction. This elevated perspective allows you to spot potential threats long before they reach the castle. But it also means you're exposed to weather conditions that can range from merely uncomfortable to genuinely dangerous. Medieval wall duty meant standing exposed to rain, snow, wind, and temperature extremes while maintaining constant vigilance for threats that might appear at any time. The daily routine of wall duty involves systematic observation of approach routes, regular communication with other guards and castle officials, and maintenance of defensive equipment that needs to be ready for immediate use. You're scanning the horizon for signs of approaching riders, dust clouds that might indicate larger groups moving in your direction, smoke from distant fires that could signal trouble, or any unusual activity in the surrounding area that might represent potential threats to castle security. Communication systems for castle guards were surprisingly sophisticated, involving horn calls, flag signals, and sometimes more elaborate systems of mirrors or smoke signals that could relay information quickly across distances. Each type of signal had specific meanings that were understood by all guards, and the system was designed to provide clear information about the type, size, and direction of approaching threats. A single horn blast might indicate friendly travelers, while multiple blasts could signal hostile forces requiring immediate defensive preparations. The weapons available to wall guards were chosen specifically for defensive effectiveness from elevated positions. Crossbows were particularly popular because they could be loaded and aimed more easily than longbows in confined spaces, and they delivered tremendous stopping power against armored opponents. Spears and pikes were essential for close-range defense if attackers managed to scale the walls, while stones, boiling oil, and other projectiles could be dropped on enemies attempting to breach the fortifications. One fascinating aspect of medieval wall defense is the psychological warfare component that was just as important as physical defensive capabilities. The mere presence of alert guards on the walls sent a message to potential attackers about the castle's state of readiness and defensive capabilities. A well-manned wall with visible guards and obvious defensive preparations could sometimes deter attacks entirely, while walls that appeared undermanned or unprepared might invite assault attempts. The architectural features of castle walls were designed to maximize defensive advantages for guards while minimizing exposure to enemy weapons. Crenellations, the characteristic notch pattern along the top of castle walls, provided protection for defenders while allowing them to observe and shoot at attackers. Arrow loops in wall towers offered protected positions for archers, while murder holes allowed defenders to attack enemies who had penetrated the outer defenses. Every architectural detail served specific defensive purposes refined through centuries of siege warfare experience. Weather considerations played a major role in wall duty because guards needed to maintain effectiveness regardless of conditions. Rain made surfaces slippery and affected the reliability of bowstrings and other equipment. Snow and ice created hazardous footing and limited visibility. High winds affected the accuracy of projectile weapons and made communication difficult. Extreme heat or cold could affect guard alertness and physical capabilities. Medieval wall guards developed techniques and equipment designed to maintain defensive effectiveness despite challenging weather conditions. The social dynamics of wall duty created unique relationships among guards who shared the isolation, responsibility, and potential danger of defensive service. Guards developed strong bonds based on mutual dependence and shared risk, and they often created informal systems for supporting each other during long, boring shifts or dangerous situations. The guard community had its own hierarchy, traditions, and culture that existed somewhat separately from the broader castle social structure. Night duty presented special challenges because visibility was limited to what could be observed by moonlight or torchlight, while the risks of surprise attack actually increased. Medieval attackers often preferred nighttime assaults because darkness provided concealment for approach and preparation. Night guards developed enhanced listening skills and learned to identify sounds that might indicate approaching threats. They also used various techniques for maintaining alertness during long, dark hours when a natural tendency was to become drowsy or inattentive. Historians still argue about the effectiveness of different medieval castle defensive strategies, but it's clear that well-designed walls with competent guards were genuinely formidable obstacles for potential attackers. The combination of architectural advantages, defensive weapons, and trained personnel created defensive systems that could withstand prolonged sieges and deter casual attacks. However, the effectiveness of wall defenses depended heavily on adequate supplies, motivated defenders, and leadership that could coordinate defensive efforts effectively. The routine maintenance required for effective wall defense was extensive and ongoing. Defensive equipment needed regular inspection and repair. Wall surfaces required periodic maintenance to prevent structural problems, and guard positions needed to be supplied with weapons, ammunition, and other necessities. The logistics of maintaining effective wall defenses represented a significant ongoing expense and labor commitment for castle communities. Training for wall duty involved both individual skills development and coordination with other guards and castle defenders. Guards needed to be competent with various weapons, familiar with communication systems, and able to function effectively as part of coordinated defensive efforts. They also needed to understand the specific defensive plan for their castle, including positions they were expected to defend, retreat routes if positions became untenable, and coordination with other defensive elements. The strategic importance of effective wall guards extended beyond immediate defensive considerations to broader political and economic implications. A castle that could defend itself effectively was more likely to maintain independence and prosperity, while a castle with poor defenses became vulnerable to conquest, tribute demands, or political pressure. Wall guards were protecting not just the physical structure of the castle, but the entire way of life for everyone who depended on the castle for security and economic opportunity. As your shift on the walls continues, you're experiencing the peculiar combination of responsibility and monotony that characterizes much of medieval military service. The duty is genuinely important. The potential consequences of failure are serious, and the skills required are real, but the day-to-day reality often involves long periods of routine observation punctuated by brief moments of intense activity. It's a reminder that medieval life, even in its most dramatic aspects, was often characterized by the need for sustained attention to duty regardless of personal comfort or preference. As darkness settles over the castle and the day's work officially ends, the great hall transforms into medieval entertainment central, where the combination of flickering firelight, flowing ale, and communal exhaustion creates an atmosphere that's part social club, part performance venue, and part informal news network. You're about to experience how medieval people unwound after days filled with physical labor, political tension, and the constant low-level stress of living in a world where comfort and security were never guaranteed. The evening gathering in the Great Hall isn't optional entertainment. It's an essential social institution that serves multiple functions beyond simple amusement. This is where the castle community comes together to process the day's events, share information, reinforce social bonds, and temporarily escape the harsh realities of medieval life through stories, music, games, and conversation. The atmosphere is more relaxed than during formal meals, but the underlying social hierarchies remain firmly in place, creating an interesting dynamic where people can interact more freely while still acknowledging their relative positions in the castle's complex social structure. The entertainment begins as soon as the evening meal is cleared away and the tables are pushed back to create more open space in the center of the hall. Musicians appear with instruments that range from simple pipes and drums to more elaborate harps, lutes, and stringed instruments that produce surprisingly sophisticated music. Medieval musicians were often traveling professionals who moved from castle to castle, bringing news, songs, and stories from distant places. But many castles also had resident musicians who provided regular entertainment and knew the specific preferences of their audiences. Storytelling represents one of the most important forms of medieval entertainment, serving functions that go well beyond simple amusement. Professional storytellers, troubadours, minstrels, or bards were walking libraries who preserved and transmitted cultural knowledge, historical events, and moral instruction through epic poems, romantic tales, and heroic narratives. These weren't just entertainment. They were education, news distribution, and cultural preservation all rolled into performances that could last for hours and continue across multiple evenings. The stories themselves covered an incredible range of subjects and styles, from epic tales of heroic knights and their adventures to romantic stories of courtly love, religious narratives about saints and miracles, and historical accounts of famous battles and political events. The best storytellers were genuinely skilled performers who could adapt their material to different audiences, modify stories based on local interests, and keep listeners engaged through voice modulation, dramatic gestures, and audience interaction techniques that would be familiar to modern stand-up comedians. One particularly fascinating aspect of medieval storytelling is how these performances served as unofficial news networks that distributed information across medieval Europe. Traveling storytellers carried news about political developments, military campaigns, natural disasters, and other significant events, incorporating current events into traditional narrative frameworks that made the information more memorable and entertaining. Historians still argue about the accuracy of historical information transmitted through storytelling traditions, but it's clear that these performances played crucial roles in keeping isolated communities connected to broader cultural and political developments. Dancing was another popular form of evening entertainment that allowed people to participate actively rather than just observe performances. Medieval dances ranged from simple folk dances that everyone could join to more elaborate courtly dances that demonstrated social sophistication and provided opportunities for carefully regulated social interaction between men and women. The dances were often accompanied by songs that everyone knew, creating communal experiences that reinforced social bonds and provided physical exercise after days spent primarily in work-related activities. Games and gambling provided another category of evening entertainment that could range from simple dice games to elaborate board games that required strategic thinking and could continue for hours. Chess was popular among the educated classes, while simpler games were accessible to people regardless of literacy or social status. Gambling was technically discouraged by church authorities, but it was widely practiced and provided excitement and potential economic opportunity for people whose daily lives offered limited chances for dramatic change in their circumstances. The evening entertainment also included various forms of performance art that might seem strange to modern audiences, but were popular in medieval settings. These could include juggling, acrobatics, trained animal performances, and various forms of comedy that relied heavily on physical humor, wordplay, and social satire. Professional entertainers developed specialties and traveling circuits that took them from castle to castle, and successful performers could achieve considerable fame and financial success within medieval entertainment networks. Conversation itself was a form of entertainment that was more structured and purposeful than modern casual chat. Medieval people were skilled in various forms of verbal entertainment, including riddles, word games, debate exercises, and storytelling competitions where individuals would try to outdo each other with clever tales or witty observations. These conversational entertainments served educational functions while providing amusement, and they helped develop verbal skills that were valuable in a largely oral culture. The role of alcohol in evening entertainment cannot be overlooked because ale and wine were central to social relaxation and community bonding. Medieval people drank alcoholic beverages not just for pleasure, but because they were often safer than water and provided calories and nutrients that supplemented their diets. The evening drinking was usually moderate by modern standards, but it was enough to relax social inhibitions and create a more open atmosphere for entertainment and conversation. Seasonal variations in evening entertainment reflected the agricultural calendar and the availability of different resources throughout the year. Winter evenings were longer and required more indoor entertainment, while summer allowed for outdoor activities and extended social gatherings. Religious holidays and seasonal festivals provided opportunities for special entertainment that might include elaborate performances, extended celebrations, and rare delicacies that mark these occasions as significantly different from ordinary evenings. The acoustic properties of the Great Hall created unique opportunities for musical and vocal performances that took advantage of the stone architecture to enhance sound quality and create impressive audio effects. Skilled musicians understood how to work with the hall's acoustics to create performances that were genuinely moving and emotionally powerful. The combination of firelight, architectural grandeur, and enhanced acoustics could transform simple songs or stories into experiences that stayed with listeners for years. Gender dynamics in evening entertainment reflected broader medieval social structures, while also providing some opportunities for more relaxed interaction between men and women. Certain types of entertainment were gender-specific, while others allowed for mixed participation under carefully regulated circumstances. Women often played important roles as performers, particularly in music and storytelling, and evening entertainment provided one of the few contexts where talented women could achieve recognition and status based on their skills rather than their family connections. The economic aspects of evening entertainment were significant because professional entertainers needed to be paid, special foods or drinks might be provided for celebrations, and the time spent in entertainment represented opportunity costs for communities that operated on tight schedules and limited resources. However, the social and psychological benefits of regular entertainment were considered essential for maintaining community cohesion and individual well-being. As the evening progresses and the fires begin to die down, you're experiencing the gradual transition from active entertainment to quiet conversation and eventual preparation for sleep. The evening entertainment serves as a buffer between the demands of daily work and the vulnerability of sleep, providing psychological comfort and social connection that help people cope with the stresses and uncertainties of medieval life. Tomorrow will bring another day of hard work and potential dangers, but tonight offers the temporary respite that makes survival possible and occasionally even enjoyable. The noble bedchamber represents the most private and paradoxically most public space in the entire castle, where personal intimacy collides with political necessity, and where the most powerful people in the castle community are simultaneously at their most vulnerable and most carefully observed. You're entering a world where privacy is a luxury that even the wealthy can barely afford, where personal relationships are inseparable from political alliances, and where the bedroom serves as an unofficial center of power that rivals the Great Hall in its importance to castle politics. The physical space of a noble bedchamber is designed to project power and status even during the most private moments. The bed itself is often the most expensive single item in the entire castle, featuring elaborate wooden frameworks, expensive textiles, and decorative elements that demonstrate the lord's wealth and taste. The bed hangings aren't just for warmth and privacy. They're displays of conspicuous consumption involving imported fabrics, intricate embroidery, and colors that were expensive to produce. Everything in the chamber, from the furniture to the decorative objects, sends messages about the occupant's position in medieval society. But here's the fascinating paradox of noble bedchambers. Despite being private spaces, they're actually quite public in ways that would shock modern sensibilities. Servants have constant access for cleaning, maintenance, and personal service. Political advisors might be received in the bedchamber for confidential discussions. Important guests might be entertained in these private spaces as a mark of special favor. The bedchamber functions as an office, meeting room, and reception area, as well as a private retreat, which means that the most intimate space in the castle is also one of the most politically active. The daily routine in noble bedchambers involves elaborate rituals of dressing and undressing that require multiple servants and can take substantial amounts of time. Medieval noble clothing was complex, involving multiple layers that needed to be put on and removed in specific orders, with ties, laces, and fastenings that couldn't be managed without assistance. The morning dressing ritual and evening undressing ceremony were formal procedures that demonstrated status while providing opportunities for private conversation between the noble and their most trusted servants. Personal hygiene in the noble bedchamber was significantly more elaborate than elsewhere in the castle, involving special equipment, imported soaps and perfumes, and servants specifically trained in personal care. The chamber contained wash basins, mirrors, combs, and other grooming tools that represented considerable investments in personal care equipment. However, even noble hygiene was limited by medieval technology and understanding, so the gap between noble and common cleanliness was smaller than the gap in other areas of daily life. The political significance of noble bedchambers cannot be overstated because this is where many of the most important decisions affecting the entire castle community were actually made. Late-night conversations between husband and wife could determine military strategies, economic policies, and political alliances that would affect hundreds of people. The bedchamber was where unofficial advisors, particularly spouses, could exercise influence that might not be acknowledged publicly, but was nonetheless real and significant. Marriage politics played out dramatically in noble bedchambers because medieval marriages among the nobility were primarily political and economic alliances rather than romantic partnerships. The bedchamber was where these political arrangements had to be translated into personal relationships that were functional enough to produce heirs and maintain the alliance. The success or failure of these intimate political relationships could determine the stability of entire regions, making the noble bedchamber a surprisingly important venue for international diplomacy. One fascinating aspect of noble bedchamber life is the role of legitimate and illegitimate children in medieval politics. The bedchamber was where legitimate heirs were conceived and born, but it was also where the political complexities of extramarital relationships had to be managed. Medieval nobles often had acknowledged illegitimate children who received some support and recognition, and the management of these complex family relationships required considerable diplomatic skill from everyone involved. The health and medical care available in noble bedchambers was the best that medieval medicine could provide, but it was still limited by the scientific understanding of the time. Childbirth was particularly dangerous, and noble women faced the same risks as common women despite having access to the best available medical assistance. The bedchamber was where life and death medical dramas played out, often with significant political consequences if the lord or lady died or became incapacitated. Privacy in noble bedchambers was a relative concept because medieval people had different expectations about personal space and private time. Servants slept in the same room or nearby chambers, and the presence of other people was considered normal rather than intrusive. However, nobles did have more opportunities for private conversation and intimate moments than other castle residents, and they could exclude people from their bedchambers when necessary for confidential discussions or personal time. The economic management of castle affairs often took place in the noble bedchamber because this was where the lord and lady could discuss financial matters privately without being overheard by people who might use the information inappropriately. Account books might be reviewed, tax collection discussed, and major expenditure decisions made during private bedchamber conversations. The chamber served as an informal office where the most sensitive economic decisions were made. Historians still argue about the extent to which medieval noble marriages involved genuine affection and companionship versus purely political arrangements. But evidence from personal letters and contemporary accounts suggests that many couples did develop real emotional bonds despite the political origins of their relationships. The bedchamber was where these emotional relationships developed and were maintained, often growing into partnerships that combined political necessity with genuine personal attachment. The security concerns for noble bedchambers were significant because this was where the castle's most important people were most vulnerable. Special arrangements were made for guarding access to these chambers, and trusted servants often slept nearby to provide both personal service and security. The bedchamber's location within the castle was chosen carefully to balance accessibility for daily functions with defensibility in case of attack or internal threats. Religious observances in noble bedchambers reflected the integration of spiritual and temporal authority that characterized medieval society. Private prayers, religious artifacts, and sometimes private chaplains provided spiritual guidance and comfort in the most intimate setting. The bedchamber might contain religious books, relics, or other sacred objects that provided personal spiritual support, while also demonstrating public piety. The seasonal rhythms of castle life were particularly evident in the noble bedchamber because this is where the effects of changing weather, agricultural cycles, and political seasons were most directly experienced by the people making decisions for the entire community. Winter brought challenges of heating and supply management, while summer brought opportunities for travel, warfare, and political activities that required careful planning and coordination. As you observe the complex dynamics of noble bedchamber life, you're witnessing the intersection of personal vulnerability and political power that characterized medieval nobility. These people lived lives that were simultaneously privileged and constrained, private and public, powerful and precarious. The bedchamber represents both the pinnacle of medieval luxury and the essential humanity of people who carried enormous responsibilities while dealing with the same basic human needs, fears, and desires that affect everyone regardless of social status or historical period. The distant horns echo across the valley like a death knell, and you feel your stomach drop as you recognize the sound. Enemy forces approaching. Within hours, the castle transforms from your familiar home into a fortress under siege, and you're about to discover just how thin the line between civilization and survival really is. The massive wooden gates slam shut with a finality that makes your ears ring. The portcullis crashes down like a metal curtain, and suddenly you're trapped inside these walls with everyone else. Lord, lady, knight, and servant alike, all equally prisoners of circumstance. You watch from the battlements as enemy tents bloom across the landscape like deadly flowers, their colorful banners fluttering in the breeze as if this were some grand tournament rather than a siege designed to starve you into submission. The enemy commander knows that direct assault is costly and dangerous. Instead, they'll simply wait for hunger and disease to do their work. Your daily routine shifts dramatically as rationing begins immediately, and you discover that a siege transforms even the mightiest castle into a desperate community where every grain of wheat becomes precious as gold. The first week feels almost adventurous, like an extended house party with higher stakes, but by the second month, you're learning exactly why medieval sieges could last for years. Your meals shrink from hearty portions to carefully measured rations, and you begin to understand the grim mathematics of survival. How many people, how much food, how long can this last? The castle's storerooms, once seemingly endless, reveal their finite nature as barrels of grain and salt pork dwindle with alarming speed. You help inventory supplies with obsessive precision, counting individual turnips like a miser counting coins, understanding that miscalculation could mean the difference between survival and starvation for everyone within these walls. Water becomes your constant concern as you help organize bucket chains from the well to various storage points throughout the castle. The well itself becomes a sacred site, guarded carefully because you all know that if the enemy manages to poison or block your water source, the siege ends quickly and badly for everyone inside. You participate in the daily ritual of checking water levels, and the collective sigh of relief when the bucket comes up full each morning becomes the soundtrack of siege life. Medieval besiegers sometimes tried to contaminate water supplies by throwing dead animals down wells, making every drink a potential gamble with death. The smell of unwashed bodies begins to permeate every corner of the castle, as soap becomes a luxury and bathing water gets reserved for drinking and cooking. You adapt to this new reality with the same pragmatism that medieval people applied to most hardships, though you can't help but think that modern deodorant would have been humanity's greatest invention from this perspective. Hygiene standards that seemed reasonable during normal times become impossible to maintain when every drop of water counts toward survival. Personal vanity transforms into a dangerous waste of resources that could keep someone alive for another day. Disease becomes your constant, invisible enemy as cramped conditions and poor sanitation create perfect breeding grounds for illness. You watch the castle's healer work tirelessly, treating everything from dysentery to fever with limited supplies and medieval understanding of medicine. When someone falls ill, the entire community holds its breath, knowing that plague or disease could accomplish what enemy weapons cannot: the complete destruction of everyone inside these walls. Medieval sieges often ended not from starvation, but from epidemic diseases that spread rapidly through confined populations. The psychological warfare begins early as enemy forces display captured supplies just outside arrow range, letting you smell cooking food that makes your mouth water and your stomach cramp with hunger. They shout taunts and false news designed to break morale, claiming that rescue armies have been defeated or that other castles have already fallen. You learn to steel yourself against these mental attacks, understanding that hope becomes as crucial a resource as food or water during extended sieges. Some besiegers employed professional entertainers to perform just beyond the walls, deliberately torturing defenders with reminders of normal life's pleasures. Sleep becomes fragmented and fitful as you participate in rotating guard duties that ensure constant vigilance against enemy tricks or surprise attacks. The darkness brings new terrors as sounds that might indicate tunneling, scaling attempts, or other forms of infiltration keep everyone on edge throughout the night. You develop the hyper-vigilant awareness that characterizes people living under constant threat, where every unexpected noise could signal disaster and every moment of relaxation might be your last mistake. Morale management becomes a survival skill as community leaders organize activities designed to maintain fighting spirit and prevent despair from destroying group cohesion. You participate in singing sessions, storytelling circles, and even indoor games that help pass time, while keeping minds focused on something besides hunger and fear. Medieval commanders understood that broken morale killed more defenders than enemy weapons, making entertainment and community building essential military strategies rather than frivolous luxuries. The castle's social hierarchy begins to break down under siege conditions as survival needs override normal class distinctions, creating temporary equality based on shared danger rather than inherited status. You watch nobles perform menial tasks alongside servants, understanding that starvation makes everyone equal and that useful skills matter more than bloodline when death threatens the entire community. Knights learn to mend their own equipment while ladies help in the kitchen, creating cooperation that would be impossible under normal circumstances. Historians still argue whether the longest medieval siege really lasted 4 years of the Château de Montségur. But regardless of exact records, you begin to understand how people could endure such extended isolation when survival itself becomes a full-time occupation. Every day brings new challenges and small victories. A successful hunt for rats in the granary, discovering a forgotten cache of preserved fruit, or simply waking up to find that everyone made it through another night. The castle that once felt like home transforms into something between sanctuary and prison, and you realize that medieval people possessed a resilience that modern life rarely demands or develops, forged through constant exposure to hardship that would break contemporary spirits within weeks rather than months. The sharp cry echoes through the castle corridors at 3 in the morning, and you're awakened not by battle horns or enemy attacks, but by the primal sound of new life entering this medieval world. Childbirth in a castle means the entire community becomes involved whether they want to or not, as the ladies' labor pains transform the Great Hall into an impromptu birthing chamber where privacy becomes impossible and survival depends on collective prayer and medieval medical knowledge. You find yourself pressed into service, whether fetching hot water, tearing clean linens, or simply holding vigil while the castle's women folk take charge of this ancient female mystery that bridges the gap between life and death in ways that medieval people understood with visceral clarity. The birthing chamber fills with smoke from burning herbs that are supposed to ease pain and prevent evil spirits from harming mother or child. Though you suspect the main effect is making everyone lightheaded while they wait for nature to take its course. Sage, rosemary, and other aromatic plants create a haze that mingles with incense and candlelight to transform an ordinary room into something approaching a sacred space where the veil between worlds seems thin enough to touch. The castle's lady grips your hand with surprising strength as contractions hit, and you realize that noble birth or common blood makes no difference when facing the fundamental human experience of bringing life into this dangerous medieval world. Medieval mothers faced roughly a 10% chance of dying in childbirth, odds that make every successful delivery feel like a miracle worth celebrating with the kind of religious fervor usually reserved for battlefield victories or harvest festivals. You participate in the urgent prayers that accompany each stage of labor, understanding that medieval people approached birth as a collaboration between human effort and divine intervention, with both elements equally necessary for successful outcomes. The midwife works with skills passed down through generations of women who learned by watching, assisting, and gradually accumulating the practical knowledge that medical schools wouldn't systematize for centuries. When the baby finally arrives, healthy and screaming, the entire castle erupts in celebration that seems disproportionate until you understand the mathematics of medieval infant mortality. This child has perhaps a 50-50 chance of surviving to adulthood, making their first breath of victory against odds that would terrify modern parents accustomed to expecting successful pregnancies and healthy babies as normal outcomes rather than miraculous exceptions. Medieval people celebrated birth with the intensity that comes from understanding how precious and fragile new life really is when medical knowledge remains limited and death stalks every stage of human development. You participate in the hasty baptism that occurs within hours of birth, understanding that medieval people couldn't risk waiting when death could claim the unbaptized soul at any moment. The priest arrives despite the hour, carrying holy water and performing sacraments designed to secure the infant's eternal salvation before earthly dangers could intervene. This urgency reflects medieval Christianity's emphasis on preparation for death that could arrive without warning, making spiritual security more important than physical comfort or social convention. The opposite end of life's spectrum arrives just as suddenly when the castle's oldest knight takes to his bed with what everyone recognizes as his final illness. You help arrange the death vigil, where community members take turns sitting beside the dying man, ensuring he doesn't face his final moments alone in a culture that viewed solitary death as one of life's greatest tragedies. Medieval death was a communal affair, not the sterile, private experience that modern hospitals provide, and you discover there's something both comforting and terrifying about watching life ebb away in full view of everyone who cared about the deceased. The last rites become a solemn ceremony that transforms the dying knight's chamber into a sacred space where temporal concerns fade before eternal questions that medieval people considered far more important than earthly achievements or material possessions. You listen as the priest performs the final sacraments, understanding that medieval people faced death with a combination of terror and acceptance that modern medical advances have largely eliminated from contemporary experience. The knight confesses his sins with brutal honesty, understanding that deathbed lies serve no purpose when facing divine judgment within hours or minutes. When death finally arrives, you participate in the immediate practical concerns that medieval communities couldn't avoid: washing and preparing the body, organizing the wake, arranging burial details that must happen quickly in an era without refrigeration or embalming. The castle's great hall transforms into a funeral chamber where where everyone gathers to honor the deceased and share memories that preserve his legacy in an age before written records captured most people's lives. These oral traditions become the primary method of preserving individual memory, making communal remembrance a sacred duty that ensures the dead continue living through stories told by those who survive them. The funeral procession moves through the castle courtyard with medieval pageantry that serves both religious and social functions, demonstrating the deceased's importance while reminding everyone of their own mortality in ways that modern funeral practices often try to soften or avoid. You carry part of the funeral feast, understanding that medieval wakes combined grief with celebration, honoring the dead while affirming life's continuation for those who remain. The knight's sword and shield hang in the chapel as permanent reminders of his service, creating the kind of physical memorial that medieval people preferred over abstract monuments. Medieval people experienced birth and death as community events that involved everyone regardless of social rank, creating shared experiences that bound castle residents together in ways that modern privacy and medical professionalism cannot replicate. You realize that witnessing both life's beginning and end within these castle walls creates a different relationship with mortality, one where death seems neither distant nor abstract, but rather a familiar presence that gives meaning and urgency to every day of life. This intimate acquaintance with life's fundamental transitions creates wisdom that contemporary society, with its medical interventions and institutional death, rarely develops. Historians still argue whether medieval people really possessed greater acceptance of death or simply lacked alternatives to such acceptance. But living through these intense life and death moments teaches you that castle communities developed emotional resilience that modern comfort has largely eliminated. The cycle continues as you help welcome new babies and bid farewell to longtime residents, understanding that these stone walls contain not just military fortification, but the complete human experience of joy, sorrow, hope, and loss that defines every generation's struggle to create meaning within temporary existence, bounded by the eternal mysteries of birth and death. The bells ring out in patterns you've learned to recognize as celebration rather than alarm, and suddenly the castle's normal routine dissolves into something approaching organized chaos as everyone prepares for the feast of St. Michael. One of those rare occasions when medieval life temporarily abandons its usual grim practicality for actual joy. You watch servants scurrying through corridors with armloads of tapestries and precious table linens that spend most of the year locked away, transforming the great hall from functional dining space into something resembling the medieval equivalent of a ballroom, complete with enough candles to make the stone walls flicker with warm, dancing light that banishes winter's gloom and creates an atmosphere of magic that seems impossible within these military walls. The kitchen becomes a scene of controlled madness as cooks prepare dishes that castle residents normally only dream about. Roasted peacock with feathers carefully reattached for display, elaborate sugar sculptures that cost more than most people earn in months, and wines that have been aging in the castle's cellars since before you were born. You help carry platters that seem designed more for visual impact than practical eating, understanding that medieval feasts served political and social functions that transcended mere nutrition or hunger satisfaction. The head cook orchestrates this culinary theater with the intensity of a military commander, coordinating dozens of assistants in preparing foods that exist primarily to demonstrate wealth, sophistication, and the Lord's ability to provide abundance even during harsh winter months. Musicians arrive from neighboring towns, carrying instruments that fill the great hall with sounds rarely heard within these military walls. Lutes and harps creating melodies that seem to soften the harsh stone surfaces and make everyone forget, temporarily, that this building was designed for warfare rather than entertainment. You find yourself swept into dancing that ranges from stately court measures to peasant reels that get increasingly energetic as the wine flows and social barriers temporarily dissolve under the influence of music and celebration. Medieval dances served as acceptable forms of physical contact between unmarried people, making festivals crucial opportunities for courtship that normal castle life strictly regulated. The feast itself becomes a theatrical production where each course arrives with ceremony that borders on religious ritual, complete with fanfares and elaborate presentations that turn eating into entertainment worthy of royal courts. You taste delicacies that exist nowhere else in your normal medieval diet. Imported spices that cost fortunes, elaborate sauces that require days of preparation, and sweetmeats that seem designed to prove that human ingenuity can transform basic ingredients into something approaching art. Medieval feast menus could include dozens of courses, creating eating marathons that lasted for hours and left everyone uncomfortably full while demonstrating the host's generosity and sophisticated taste. Games and entertainments fill the evening hours as professional performers demonstrate skills that seem magical to people accustomed to medieval life's usual harsh realities. Jugglers keeping impossible numbers of objects airborne, storytellers weaving tales that transport listeners to distant lands filled with heroes and monsters, and acrobats performing feats that defy understanding of human physical limitations. You participate in contests of strength and skill that create temporary hierarchies based on talent rather than birth. Watching kitchen servants defeat knights at archery, while stable boys outperform nobles at wrestling, creating brief moments when merit matters more than bloodline. The religious elements weave through secular celebration as priests bless the feast and lead prayers that remind everyone why this particular saint deserves such elaborate honor. Though you suspect most participants focus more on present pleasure than spiritual significance. Medieval Christianity integrated seamlessly with celebration, creating festivals that satisfied both religious obligation and human need for periodic escape from daily hardship and routine responsibility. These feast days provided theological justification for indulgence that church doctrine normally discouraged, allowing medieval people to enjoy earthly pleasures without compromising their spiritual salvation. Children run through the Great Hall with freedom normally forbidden in these formal spaces, their laughter echoing off stone walls that usually hear only adult conversations about serious matters like warfare, politics, and survival. You watch noble children playing with servants' offspring in temporary equality that festival atmosphere makes possible, understanding that medieval celebrations created brief interludes where normal social rules relaxed without completely disappearing. These moments of cross-class interaction helped build the community bonds that made castle society function effectively during normal times when hierarchy reasserted itself. The evening stretches far beyond normal bedtime as candles burn down to stubs, and people reluctant to end this rare magical experience continue dancing, singing, and sharing stories that will be remembered and retold during the long months between celebrations. You find yourself staying awake despite exhaustion, understanding instinctively that these moments of pure joy are precious enough to warrant losing sleep over their preservation. Medieval people structured their entire emotional calendar around these periodic celebrations, making festival memories serve as psychological sustenance during the hardest periods of winter scarcity and daily drudgery. Costumes and masks appear as the night progresses, allowing people to temporarily adopt different identities and engage in behaviors that would be scandalous under normal circumstances. You participate in this medieval version of masquerade, understanding that festival license provided socially acceptable outlets for desires and behaviors that castle hierarchy normally suppressed. Lords might serve their servants, women might adopt masculine roles, and everyone could experiment with temporary reversals of normal social order without permanently threatening the system that governed their daily lives. Food fights and elaborate practical jokes emerge as wine loosens inhibitions and festival spirit encourages playfulness that would result in severe punishment during ordinary times. You dodge flying bread rolls and participate in mock battles fought with kitchen utensils, understanding that medieval people needed these pressure release valves to maintain psychological health within social systems that demanded constant deference and rigid behavioral control. The mess created during these celebrations would take days to clean up, but everyone accepts this as a reasonable price for communal joy. Historians still argue whether medieval people really experienced more intense festival joy, because such celebrations were rarer than modern entertainment. But you certainly feel the difference between this concentrated celebration and the casual pleasures that modern life distributes throughout every week. The contrast between feast and famine, celebration and routine, creates an emotional intensity that makes every sensory detail, taste, sound, sight, smell, burn itself into memory with unusual clarity and permanence. These festivals provided psychological landmarks that helped medieval people organize their understanding of time's passage and create meaning through shared cultural experiences. As dawn approaches and the celebration finally winds down, you help clean up debris from the night's festivities while already looking forward to the next festival months away, understanding that medieval people structured their entire emotional calendar around these periodic explosions of joy that made the intervening hardship bearable and gave everyone something to anticipate during the darkest moments of castle life. The whispered conversation stops abruptly as you enter the chamber, and you realize you've stumbled into one of those delicate political discussions that could mean the difference between prosperity and disaster for everyone living within these castle walls. Medieval politics operates on personal relationships and family alliances that shift like quicksand, and you're discovering that survival in castle society requires developing the same diplomatic skills that keep kingdoms from destroying each other in constant warfare. Every gesture, every word, every moment of eye contact carries potential meaning that could be interpreted as loyalty, betrayal, or dangerous ambition that threatens the delicate balance of power that keeps this community functioning. You learn to read the subtle signs that indicate political weather changes. When certain courtiers suddenly become unavailable for conversation, when familiar faces disappear from the Great Hall without explanation, when messages arrive that send the Lord into private conferences lasting hours behind closed doors. The castle's political atmosphere shifts daily based on news from distant battles, marriage negotiations between noble families, and the complex web of feudal obligations that bind everyone from peasant to king in relationships of mutual dependence and potential conflict. Medieval politics moved at the speed of horse-mounted messengers, meaning that crucial decisions often had to be made based on incomplete information about rapidly changing circumstances. Marriage becomes the ultimate political weapon as you witness negotiations that treat human hearts like chess pieces, moving daughters and sons into strategic positions designed to create alliances, secure borders, or access distant resources that could determine whether this castle prospers or falls to enemies who understand the marriage game better than its current players. You observe young nobles being coached in the political implications of their romantic choices, understanding that medieval love was a luxury that could destabilize kingdoms if allowed to override practical considerations of power, wealth, and military security. These arranged marriages often work surprisingly well, though you can't help but think that dating apps would have simplified medieval politics considerably. Letters arrive sealed with wax emblems that everyone recognizes instantly, and you watch the Lord's face carefully as he breaks each seal, understanding that correspondence from certain sources could contain anything from wedding invitations to declarations of war that would transform castle life overnight. Medieval communication moved at horse speed, meaning that political crises could develop for weeks or months before anyone in the castle learned about changing circumstances that might affect their survival, prosperity, or allegiance to distant authorities whose decisions shaped local reality. The messenger system created delays that forced medieval politicians to make crucial decisions based on outdated information about situations that might have changed completely since the relevant letters were written. The art of useful conversation becomes a survival skill as you learn which topics can be discussed openly, which require careful euphemism, and which must never be mentioned in mixed company regardless of their obvious importance to everyone present. You develop the ability to have entire conversations about dangerous political topics without ever stating anything directly, using references, implications, and shared understanding to communicate information that could be treasonous if spoken plainly or overheard by the wrong people. Medieval courtiers perfected this diplomatic doublespeak as protection against political winds that could shift suddenly and make yesterday's acceptable opinions today's capital crimes. Loyalty oaths become regular ceremonies that reinforce the feudal bonds holding medieval society together. Though you begin to understand that these public displays of allegiance often mask private calculations about changing sides when circumstances make betrayal more profitable than faithfulness. You participate in these ritual affirmations while watching for the subtle signs that indicate who might be wavering in their commitment to current political arrangements, understanding that medieval politics rewarded those who anticipated changing circumstances before they became obvious to everyone. The ceremony itself becomes theater designed to reinforce social bonds while providing opportunities for careful observation of potential traitors or unreliable allies. Spies and informants move through castle society with identities that remain hidden even from people who interact with them daily, creating an atmosphere of paranoid caution where casual remarks could be reported to enemies or allies depending on political winds that shift without warning. You learn to assume that anything you say might be repeated in contexts you cannot predict, developing the careful speech patterns that characterize people living under constant surveillance by invisible authorities. Medieval espionage relied heavily on personal relationships and casual conversation, making every social interaction potentially dangerous for people who possessed sensitive information or held controversial opinions. The balance between different noble families creates ongoing tension that affects everything from seating arrangements at formal dinners to military appointments that could tip regional power toward one faction or another. You watch these family rivalries play out through seemingly minor social interactions that actually represent major political maneuvering designed to secure advantages that might prove crucial during future conflicts or negotiations. Medieval politics operated through extended family networks that could include hundreds of people connected by blood, marriage, or sworn allegiance, creating complex webs of obligation and opportunity that skilled politicians manipulated with chess-like precision. Religious authority intersects with secular power in ways that create additional layers of political complexity, as church officials wield influence that can override noble authority while remaining subject to political pressures that affect their own security and advancement. You navigate relationships with priests and bishops who serve multiple masters, understanding that medieval politics required balancing earthly and spiritual authorities that frequently disagreed about proper courses of action in specific circumstances. The church's wealth and influence made it a political player that could not be ignored, while its spiritual authority provided legitimacy that secular rulers needed to maintain popular support. Economic factors underlying political relationships become visible as you observe how trade agreements, tax collection, and resource access drive alliance formation and conflict development in ways that make medieval politics as much about money as about honor or family loyalty. You watch merchants and craftsmen wielding influence that seems disproportionate to their social status, understanding that economic power could translate into political leverage even within hierarchical systems that officially valued birth over wealth. Medieval commerce created networks of mutual dependence that crossed political boundaries and sometimes prevented wars that would have been economically disastrous for all parties involved. Historians still argue whether medieval political intrigue really reached the sophisticated levels portrayed in modern fiction, but you certainly experience enough backstabbing, alliance shifting, and careful manipulation to understand that medieval people developed political skills that would impress contemporary diplomats. The stakes feel immediate and personal when political decisions could result in losing your home, your life, or your family's future within a matter of weeks or months, creating intensity that makes every political conversation feel like a high-stakes game where miscalculation could prove fatal. The morning light slants through the narrow window at a different angle than you remember from your youth, and you realize that decades of castle life have passed while you were focused on daily survival, political maneuvering, and the countless small dramas that filled each year with urgent concerns that now seem distant as childhood memories. Your reflection in the polished metal mirror shows lines and scars that tell the story of medieval life lived fully within these stone walls. Weathered hands that have hauled water during sieges, eyes that have witnessed births and deaths, shoulders that have carried responsibilities you never imagined when you first walked through these gates as a young person full of expectations about castle life. That experience has both fulfilled and transformed in unexpected ways. The castle itself has aged alongside you, with newer sections added to accommodate growing households, older walls showing wear from weather and occasional warfare, and modifications that reflect changing military technology and domestic preferences of successive lords who shaped this place according to their own needs and dreams. You trace familiar paths through corridors that feel simultaneously eternal and fragile, understanding that these stones will outlast everyone currently living within them, while carrying forward the accumulated human experience of generations who called this fortress home. The physical structure serves as memory made manifest, with every architectural detail preserving stories of people who lived, worked, loved, and died within these protective walls. Your position in castle hierarchy has evolved through decades of service, loyalty, and survival, earning you respect and responsibilities that younger residents seek your advice about navigating the same challenges you once faced with uncertainty and occasional terror. You find yourself becoming the keeper of institutional memory, the person who remembers how things were done during previous crises, who knows which strategies worked and which failed during past emergencies that current residents hear about only as stories rather than lived experience. This role transforms you from participant to guardian of wisdom, responsible for preserving knowledge that could mean survival for future generations facing similar challenges. The routine that once felt restrictive now provides comfort as you participate in daily rhythms that connect you to castle life's essential purposes: defense, community, survival, and the preservation of civilization within these protective walls. Morning prayers, shared meals, work assignments, evening gatherings all flow together in patterns that create meaning through repetition and shared participation rather than individual achievement or personal fulfillment as modern life defines these concepts. Medieval people found satisfaction in contributing to something larger than themselves, understanding that community survival mattered more than personal advancement or individual recognition. Young faces around the Great Hall remind you of your own arrival here, full of energy and ambition that castle life will shape, challenge, and ultimately either strengthen or break, depending on individual resilience and adaptability to medieval reality. You offer guidance when asked, sharing practical knowledge about everything from siege survival to political navigation, understanding that experience remains the only reliable teacher for skills that cannot be learned from books or formal instruction. The cyclical nature of castle life means that challenges repeat themselves in new forms, making your accumulated wisdom valuable for people facing familiar problems under changing circumstances. The relationships built over decades of shared hardship, celebration, and daily interaction create bonds that transcend the formal hierarchies that initially defined your social position within castle society. You've delivered babies with the lady of the castle, shared rations during desperate sieges with knights who initially seemed impossibly remote, and buried friends whose deaths marked the passage of time more clearly than any calendar or seasonal change could measure. These human connections provide the emotional foundation that makes castle life bearable and meaningful, creating chosen family relationships that supplement or sometimes replace biological kinship ties. Legacy becomes a daily consideration as you realize that your knowledge, skills, and accumulated wisdom will either transfer to younger generations or die with you, making every conversation with apprentices and newcomers an opportunity to preserve something valuable from your decades of castle experience. Medieval people lived with constant awareness that death could arrive suddenly, making the preservation of useful knowledge a community responsibility that everyone shared regardless of their official position or formal education. Your legacy exists not in written records, but in the practical skills and hard-won wisdom that you pass along through daily interaction with people who will carry forward what you've learned. The view from the battlements encompasses landscape that has become as familiar as your own reflection, with every distant hill, nearby village, and seasonal change marking time's passage in ways that connect you to natural rhythms that modern urban life largely obscures. You've watched this countryside through seasons of peace and war, abundance and famine, understanding that castle life creates intimate knowledge of place that few modern people experience. This geographical rootedness provides stability and identity that complement the social bonds formed within the castle community, creating multiple layers of belonging that anchor individual existence within larger patterns of meaning. Memory becomes your treasure house as you recall decades of shared experiences that created the fabric of community life. Feast days that brought joy during dark winters, crises that revealed character and forged lasting friendships, quiet moments of beauty that made hardship bearable and reminded everyone why life remains worth preserving despite its difficulties. These accumulated memories provide comfort during present challenges and wisdom for future decisions, creating internal resources that sustain you through whatever difficulties remain ahead in your castle journey. The skills you've mastered through necessity and practice represent a lifetime of learning that modern specialization rarely permits or encourages. You can preserve food, treat illness, organize defense, navigate politics, and contribute to community welfare in ways that make you valuable regardless of changing circumstances. Medieval people developed this broad competence because survival often depended on adaptability and the ability to contribute wherever help was needed most urgently. Your accumulated abilities represent security that cannot be taken away by political changes or economic disruption. Historians still argue whether medieval people really developed deeper connections to specific locations than contemporary society allows. But you certainly feel rooted to this particular place in ways that seem both limiting and liberating compared to modern mobility and career flexibility. The castle has become part of your identity in fundamental ways that would be difficult to explain to people who change residences, jobs, and social contexts with casual frequency that medieval life never permitted or encouraged. This rootedness creates belonging and purpose that transcend individual ambition or personal satisfaction. Evening approaches with the familiar sounds of daily life winding down, conversations becoming quieter, work activities concluding, the gradual transition from day's productivity to night's rest that has marked the end of thousands of days within these walls. You settle into sleep with gratitude for survival, companionship, and the simple privilege of having lived a complete life within the security and community that castle existence provided during an era when both were precious commodities that many people never experienced. Understanding that your story represents one thread in the vast tapestry of human experience that these ancient stones have witnessed and preserved.